Hello everyone, I'm Daniel. I have some role here, I'm not sure what it is, but today I want to be talking about, let's see, URL parameters. Hey, there we go. Oh, it skipped. Now, what are they? That's what we'll cover. What are the implications for SEO? And more importantly, what can we do about them in terms of how do they impact crawling, indexation, and visibility? Now, most of us have probably come across URL parameters without even knowing, whether you're browsing for something on Glam Corner, you're looking for something on Grays Online, you're looking at a translated page on any website, you will probably have come across these strange little squiggly things with a question mark and then a key and then a value and an equal sign and an ampersand. So let's get started. First of all, what is a URL parameter? Well, it is a way for us to track how URLs perform and where they're coming from. So in essence, let me show you here. This is the anatomy of a URL parameter, where here you have the normal domain and then like the sub page kind of there. And then this is where we get into the fun stuff. So anything behind a question mark, that is when you start seeing a URL parameter. And it's made up of a key and a value separated by an equal sign. And you can have multiple values, and this can be joined by an ampersand. And the first parameter always comes after the question mark. In fact, you can always spot them based on this thing. And in this example below, we can see this is the start of the URL parameter, and this is on an NRMA page. And if you've done a search within a site using a search bar on the website, you've probably come across this in the results page. So why do these things exist? Well, here are 7 common reasons why we use URL parameters or why CMSs generate them. It is for tracking purposes, reordering products on a page, so I'll get into that a little bit later. Filtering products, so these are more related to e-commerce and stores. Pagination, so when you have a blog and you're going from page 1 to page 2 to page 3, you'll come across URL parameters. Again, as I just mentioned, internal website searching, when you're looking for a particular product or a page within a website. Translation of pages, and for identifying products. Here for New Vision Psychology, we can see there is a URL parameter due to the translated version of this particular page from English to language which is Chinese. Here's another version or another use case, a pagination parameter, as we can see on Bend and Mend. Here we have \S, that usually stands for search, equals Pilates, because we're searching for Pilates within the page, within the website. And just to show you why I've got this SEO minion tab open is to show you that this is indexable, that this URL is actually crawlable and indexable by search engines, and this has ramifications for what we do. And another example, we're using Grays Online now, our favorite website, is, I actually don't know how to say this. Is this faceted or faceted? Faceted? Faceted. Faceted navigation, you heard this first. Faceted navigation parameter, and this is when you're on any shopping website and you're trying to find subcategories or a certain product, and you'll see here filtering for Volvo and then a particular model, and then you can see here it comes up in the URL parameter, whereas this is the make, which is the Volvo, and then the model, it comes up as that. Generally, we ignore this kind of stuff. We don't even notice it because it's in the navigation bar, but this has huge ramifications for crawl budget and visibility in general, and that's why we care. So URL parameters are useful, but they do come with 4 major SEO issues. And what are they? Well, problem number 1. Parameters can often create duplicate content. And in some cases, these make little to no changes to the actual page's content. For example, a page URL with tracking tags or a session tag is actually exactly the same in terms of layout and information in terms of content, text, and images, whereas a reordered version of products page is not so different because now you've jumbled, reshuffled things on the page, but it's still very similar. And these similar or duplicate pages, well, they add no value to both search engines and its users. And here's the thing, search engines treat every parameter or parameterized URL as an individual and unique page, and as such, you end up serving duplicate versions of the same thing that is targeting the same keyword. And this can lead to the canonical or master version being filtered out from the results page. So to demonstrate this, here is the static URL or the original or master or canonical version, example.com/widgets. Here we've applied a session ID, which some old legacy websites still use instead of, let's say, using cookies. As you can see, this is still the same content being served, but after the widgets, it served this URL parameter of the session ID. Here's, let's say this is the same page, but let's say they've got multiple products on the page and you've applied a filter to reorder the stuff, and now it's sorted from newest. Or you're more maybe used to doing lowest to highest in terms of price, or what's in stock, and that's where you would see that reordering parameter come through. Identifying parameter, that is, well, in this instance it's shown as a category. So let's say WooCommerce, you've set up different category tags for products, and by clicking on a checkbox you'll be served that as a page itself. And again, these are all serving exactly the same content or very similar content, and that can be a problem because essentially search engines doesn't really know which version to show. Now, these three, so example.com products, women/dresses/green.html, and the other variants of them, they may seem very unique or different at first, but they all have the exact content on page. And when search engines find such URLs and begin to crawl them, they notice duplication of this information. The algorithm groups addresses and selects one among them to display on the SERP, and this is kind of where we run into, is it showing the page that we want our users to find? And that's why we need to be wary of what a site is doing in terms of its parameterization of URLs. Now, problem number 2, parameters waste crawl budget. Now, let me just take a leaf out of Google's manual and explain what it means by this. Crawling redundant parameter pages drains crawl budget, reducing your site's ability to index SEO relevant pages and increasing server load. And we do know that although how mighty Google is, they do have limited resources, or rather they do want to limit their resources whilst crawling the web. And therefore overly complex URLs, especially those containing multiple parameters, can cause a problem for crawlers by creating unnecessary high numbers of URLs that point to identical or similar content on your site. As a result, Googlebot or any other search engine bot may consume much more bandwidth than necessary, or may be unable to completely index all the content of your site, and that would suck a lot. And you know, at the bottom of the screen, this is a screenshot of the new rebranded Google Webmaster. Now it's called Google Search Console, and here, this is like a best practice when it comes to duplicate content and URL parameters is consolidate your duplicate content, well, their recommendation is to eliminate it. Problem number 3 and 4 of URL parameters is that they split page ranking signals. And as SEOs, this is one of the things that we care a lot about, because if you have multiple versions of the same content, this means that any social shares or social signals and links are essentially being distributed across them, and therefore they're being diluted. So imagine investing in a piece of content, and as a result of tracking, sorting, or session ID, your link building and link earning efforts are being spread across multiple versions of the same content. This can negatively impact the visibility of the master URL in the SERPs for competitive keywords. Once again, you're kind of confusing search engines which page is the most important. Problem number 4, URL parameters are really, really ugly. And people tend not to trust ugly or non-clean URLs. And so this can impact your CTR and also the shareability when you, let's say a user shares it on Facebook or Twitter or any other social platform. Now, when it comes to URL parameters, how do you find them? Well, you call this old mate and he will find them, hunt them down and kill them, apparently. Well, easiest way or an easy solution is to use Screaming Frog. And so once you've completed a crawl, you can then go into this little bar and type in \, and it will filter through all the pages that have a URL parameter, and then you can use your own judgment to, I guess, analyze and decide whether these are problematic or not. Another way is to review log files, and as Dejan has already explained what log files are, essentially you're looking at what has come to your website and when. For smaller clients, this is probably not very practical. In fact, I would just use Screaming Frog, but let's say you're looking at Grays and you have millions upon millions of pages. Maybe Screaming Frog is not the best way to do so, and log file analysis, assuming that you can get them, could be an effective way to look for URL parameter issues. Or rather, is Googlebot or any search engine crawling those parameterized URLs? Another fun way to use, to discover parameterized URLs is looking at top pages in Ahrefs, or you can just simply look at organic keywords and see if any of those ranking pages have a parameterized function in it. In this case, for New Vision Psychology, this business does very well for translated pages, so I'm not really worried about that, because that is the content that is being served on these pages are completely different because it is a different language. Of course, you could use Google Search Console and look at the coverage tab to identify for URL parameters across your website. So now that you've found them, what should you do? Well, here's a quote from Jess Schultz, identifying what the problem is. URL parameters create duplicate content, waste crawl budget, and dilute ranking signals. And so let's refer to, I guess, the gatekeepers, Google. What do they say about URL parameters? Well, in an ideal world, unique content, whether an individual product, article, or category, or products or articles, would have only one accessible URL, but we don't live in this fairy tale, do we? So while humans may be able to decode odd URL parameters, crawlers have difficulty interpreting them when they're being implemented in a non-standard fashion. And when you're using non-standard encoding, this can confuse them. It is difficult for search engine crawlers to differentiate useful values from the useless ones. And for example, gummy-candy and session ID, it doesn't really understand what the difference is. They're just going to treat them as the same thing. So common values that don't change page content should be listed as URL parameters, include session IDs, tracking IDs, refer IDs, and timestamp. And to read more about it, I've included a link where this is an official Google documentation on how to treat faceted, Faceted navigation. So recommendation number 1. Now that we've discovered our website has URL parameters, what should we do? Well, we can eliminate unnecessary ones. And that's because URL parameters can be incredibly useful in providing tracking information. However, some functions are defunct. For example, session IDs. These can easily be implemented through cookies. And for e-commerce stores, filters in the faceted navigation that are rarely applied by users can be, again, eliminated. So essentially, you want to remove all instances where there is minimal usage and that causes technical debt. Similarly, URL parameters should be appended to a URL only when they serve a function. And in this example, the first one, there is a key 1 and then a key 2 and a key 3. What you'll see here is key 2 and key 3, they add absolutely no value at all, whereas this is the preferred format of the parameterization. So essentially, review all existing URL parameters and remove any that are caused by technical debt, because it's easy to prevent than to fix. And then another solution is to apply appropriate canonical tags. And what we can see here in this example that I've stolen from somewhere, I have sourced them, credited them, is \toys/trucks. And then you have a filter of the color blue, and then there's another variant of the same content where you're filtering for green. And so what you want to do is canonicalize these two variants to the master, which is the cleaner version. However, and I've bolded this tactic is not suitable when the parameter page content is not close enough to the canonical, such as pagination, searching, translating, or some filtering parameters. So use your own judgment in understanding what are the differences between the pages that are being created, and then apply one of these recommendations that we're going to cover today. Oh, the first point, I should kind of highlight that, because by adding the canonical tag, you are pretty much attributing any link equity or link juice to the master page, which is kind of what we want to do when we're talking about ranking signals. And that is exactly what JB Hi-Fi has done. Now, I don't know if you can see this, actually you should be able to. I've looked at a category page, and then I applied a filter for what is available now, and it's appended all this interesting gunk here. But what you'll see here in the page source is they've canonicalized it to just the master page, which is DJ Pro Accessories, which is a much cleaner version. So if anyone were to link to this, it would just go there. Recommendation number 3. Use a key only once and have a consistent order to parameters. Now, multiple parameters that use the same parameter name and different value, that is a big no-no. So for example, here we have multiple keys assigned and values to the same key, whereas here you just want a single key plus the value. So what's wrong with here is that there's a second key added to it. And if there is no need for a multi-select functionality, it is better to combine the values together after a single key. Now, parameter order doesn't really contribute towards this concept of duplicate content. However, it's best to, I guess, follow a consistent order, and this will require some development resources so that you can code it so that key 1 is always comes first, along with value 1 or value 2, because you can have multiple permutations of this, and it'll just waste your crawl budget again. And essentially, depending on how many products you have and how many filters you have, you can have an unlimited amount of useless URLs essentially. Another thing you can do is block the crawling of parameterized duplicate content. And this is a tool that is available within Google's Search Console. However, actually, let me just go through this slide first. If your site uses URL parameters for insignificant page variations, or if your site uses parameters that can show essentially the same content using different URLs, Google might be crawling your site inefficiently. You should use the URL parameters tool only if your site fulfills all of the following requirements, and that is your site needs to have at least 1,000 pages or more. And if you review your logs, you see a significant number of duplicate pages being indexed by Googlebot, in which all duplicate pages vary only by the parameter by itself. And this is Google's recommendation on when you would use the URL parameter tool. However, this tool has now been relegated to the legacy tool section of Google Search Console. So we don't really know what the future of this is, and I'll get to it later. Recommendation number 5, you could also consider no indexing them or disallowing crawling via robots.txt. So in case of a parameterized URL that adds no SEO value or benefit, you can set a page level no index directive. What's great about this is that it's relatively easy to do. Pretty much any webmaster can do this. Sometimes they've done this accidentally, so there you go. However, doing this will not prevent search engines from crawling the URLs, but in theory will encourage them to do so less frequently. Similarly, by applying the no index meta tag to the parameterized URLs does not consolidate ranking signals at all. So an alternative approach is to block crawler access to every parameterized URL or to a specific query string that you do not want indexed. Again, this is relatively simple to implement. It allows more efficient use of crawl budget, but again does not consolidate ranking signals and does not remove existing URLs from the index. Apparently I finished, but I swear, okay, I should read this. So back to here, I should cover. So there is this tool that I can use within GSC. I've actually never used it because it's quite scary. Then once you click on add a parameter, it gives you all this stuff. But apparently you can define which parameters you want to exclude. However, in this study that I've linked here, they found that even when they applied this, Google continued to crawl the parameterized URLs. And so again, the question that we all need to ask ourselves is, of these recommendations, I think what I should highlight is you can't do all of them. You can't do all 5 at the same time. You need to kind of pick and choose 1 or 2. And depending on how the website is set up and the resources that are available, I would recommend maybe using 1 or 2 of these recommendations. So there you go. That is URL parameters. Very, very sexy topic, I'm sure. Let's go do it.